Olá, bem-vindos e bem-vindas, um bom dia a todos. Eu sou Denise Barbosa e estamos aqui mais uma vez no estúdio da McKinsey em São Paulo. O McKinsey Talks já se consolidou como um espaço para conversas com os maiores expertos do mundo sobre temas relevantes para a agenda de negócios. E o tema de hoje são as taxas de importação sobre carbono, CBAM, riscos e oportunidades para o Brasil. Um tema bem atual e sobre a qual conversaremos na semana da COP26, a Conferência da ONU sobre as Mudanças Climáticas. Por isso, estamos conectados com Ana Moore, que é sócia da McKinsey em Londres. Good morning, Ana.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you.
It's our pleasure. Também está conosco por Zoom o Bram Smeets, que é Solution Associate Partner da McKinsey em Amsterdã. Hello, Bram.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Aqui ao meu lado, no estúdio, Henrique Ceotto, sócio da McKinsey em Minas Gerais. Tudo bem, Ceotto?
Tudo bem? Bom dia, Denise. Bom dia a todos.
Eu queria convidar vocês de casa a mandarem perguntas durante toda a sessão. A participação de vocês é fundamental. Quem estiver assistindo a nossa sessão num computador, usa o botão à direita do vídeo. Quem estiver no celular, é um botão logo abaixo. Por favor, mandem suas perguntas. Let's get started, Bram. Can you tell us about CBAM and what it is and how it's going to work, please?
Of course. Thank you very much, Denise. CBAM is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is part of the Fit for 55 policy package that the European Commission announced last summer. And CBAM intends to complement the emission trading scheme, which in essence sets a price on carbon. And in today's trading scheme, or ETS, a lot of the sectors actually get quite a lot of free allowances. So often up to 80% of the emissions in the sector are exempt from carbon prices being applied. And with an increasingly ambitious emission reduction target, the European Union wants to start reducing those free allowances. That then immediately triggers a concern around carbon leakage, which is if we start to increasingly tax companies within the bloc within the European Union, will that not create an incentive for a lot of companies to move their activities to outside of the European Union and then start importing increasingly and produce in areas where there's no carbon price applied? And to address that concern, the CBAM, in a way, at the border of the European Union bloc, draws a line and says for all of the products that will be imported into the bloc, we will start applying a carbon tax that's equivalent to the cost of carbon within the bloc. Now, the scope of CBAM today, in the way that has been proposed, is quite focused and particularly looks at 5 sectors, including the power sector, cement, iron and steel, aluminum, and fertilizers. And over time, the expectation is that that scope will further increase. We'll talk about it in a moment. But in the first wave, which will start in 2023 with a reporting period for 3 years and then be implemented in 2026, it's those 5 sectors that will be particularly impacted by CBAM. As of 2026, the actual taxation period will then start, where indeed gradually the price of carbon will be applied to all of the carbons that come into all of the products that come into the European Union bloc. The way that it works with deciding on the value of that carbon, the cost of that carbon is basically it mimics the price that's set in the European trading scheme. Now, one last reflection on the scope. The European Union also announced that at the end of the reporting period, where basically the administrative processes will be set up, there will be an explicit evaluation. So roughly by the end of 2025, it is expected that the European Union will be reflecting on both the set of products and sectors that are part of the scope of CBAM, and also on whether the scope of emissions should be expanded, for example, by looking at scope 2 emissions, which looks at the power that was used in the production process, or scope 3, which covers the entire value chain of a product. And we'll talk more about those nuances in a little moment. Now, the question then is why is that relevant for Brazilian companies? And there's two key levers that we see there that we'll talk about more today. The first one is because free allowances are going to be reduced for a lot of the sectors producing within Europe and exporting to Brazil. So in a way, for Brazilian companies that they're importing here, that means that the production cost of those products is likely going to go up. The second lever that we see is that CBAM will reshuffle the competitive equation globally by making products coming from the European Union relatively more expensive. And given that a lot of Brazilian products actually have a relatively low carbon footprint, there's significant opportunities there for Brazilian companies to take part of that market. And we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. Now, with that specification of what CBAM is, let us have a look at the global picture where this fits in. And then we actually see that today, 80% of the world's GDP, and actually more than that by now, have set net zero targets. And actually, in the run-up to the COP26 that's happening in Glasgow as we speak, this number has further increased. So the latest number is 89% of the global GDP is now coming from countries with net zero targets in place. 87% of global emissions is covered, and that triggers a big question around how are all of these countries that have now set this ambition level, how are they going to follow up on that ambition and deliver and implement? And for many economists, when they look at that question, a carbon price or some kind of carbon taxation scheme is actually considered one of the more efficient options that are at the disposal of policymakers. And for any of the countries that introduce such a carbon pricing or emission trading scheme, immediately the question of carbon leakage that we discussed earlier becomes relevant. So to give you some examples on this page, there's quite a few countries already that are considering emission trading schemes, carbon taxes as we speak. There's actually the US, UK, Canada that are specifically considering a CBAM. But as we see on this page, there's many other countries that are already having emission trading schemes in place or are at least considering them at this moment as part of their broader decarbonization strategies. When we then aggregate that, then we see that over 40% of global GDP might actually be affected by a CBAM mechanism within the decade. And we also see that if we add up all of the countries that we see highlighted on this page that are either having an emission trading scheme in place or are scheduling one, that covers over 75% of the global GDP. Now, against that background and with that context, let me actually hand over to my colleague Anna, who will talk more about the implications that this will have for Brazilian companies.
Thanks so much, Bram. I'll talk a little bit first about what it means for Brazil in terms of exports, and then a bit what it might mean on the import side. And I think what's really interesting for a country like Brazil from CBAM is that actually there could be a boost to exports in many sectors. Let me explain a little bit what I mean there. What you see on this page is a breakdown of Brazilian exports, with the dark blue being those that are covered in the first tranche of CBAM that Bram was describing, and the lighter blue being those that it's not sure yet, but we're expecting likely will be covered after the transition period ends in 2026, 2027, so a likely wave 2. Cumulatively, that's about 30% of Brazilian exports, including the EU and more broadly as destination countries that might be covered by CBAM ultimately. And for a country like Brazil that has a relatively strong renewable power base and is relatively efficient, it could actually mean that a lot of Brazilian exports will move to the left on the cost curve and become more competitive coming into the EU. Additionally, because European exports will become less competitive, given, as Bram explained, that there isn't a rebate for Europeans selling externally, it might also mean that a lot of traditional destination countries for European European exports will no longer be sourcing from Europe. And so again, a lot of trade flow reshuffling, not just to the EU, but more broadly. Bottom line is Brazil can expect to likely become more competitive in the sectors that are highlighted in blue here. And to give you one example, I'll dwell for a minute on the steel industry. What you see here is just the cost curve today for hot rolled coil without a carbon tax and without CBAM applied. And then below it, what we expect under CBAM scenario 1. And what you see is a lot of the more emitting coal-powered production moving to the right. You'll see India highlighted as an example here. The same will be true for many others as well. Whereas Brazil, we expect to move to the left. That'll be true for the US as well with electric arc furnaces. And so one of the perhaps counterintuitive implications of CBAM for many exporters, Brazil, the US, a few others, will be a growth in the potential European market. And for some, unlocking a new export market. On the import side, this is a slightly less positive story in some sectors and will require a little bit of reshuffling of supply chains for many players. So what we expect to see is that given the higher carbon tax applied on many European exports, many destination countries and importers from Europe will need to incur a higher carbon price. And so what that will mean in practice is in part absorption of those higher costs, but in part also a reshuffling of supply chains and of trade flows coming from Europe. And for Brazil in particular, I think the area to call out is taxation on European ammonia carbon, which will play out in higher costs for fertilizer imports from Europe. And for those of you in the mining industry, of course, also for explosives used in mining, which may either mean higher costs or a desire to source elsewhere. And at the minimum, a bit of reshuffling that will be needed. What do folks do in light of that? And how can executives think about responding? To massively simplify, there are 3 areas that we are seeing many corporates looking at. One is clearly core decarbonization. So getting the homework done around accelerating your pathway to net zero in order to continue to be competitive under a CBAM regime and to move even further left on the cost curve. And I think for a lot of Brazilian corporates, that's a particularly attractive opportunity in light of what we described a moment ago. I think also for those of you who are importing from the EU, it'll put a bit of pressure on scope 3 and likely accelerate decarbonization on the procurement side, a bit related to the import view that we talked about a moment ago. The second piece, not just risk mitigation, but also opportunity creation, is clearly around green business building, where we're seeing a real acceleration of folks viewing this as a competitive differentiator and also an acceleration of investment into new technologies, into new ways of operating, which can be incredibly exciting, not only for opening up new markets, but also for improving the valuation. And I think all of us, and you will have your own experiences with this as well, are starting to see the green premium play out in reality, not only in theory. That will, of course, only accelerate as policies like EU ETS and CBAM, but also, the fast follower policies that Bram was describing on that global page come to fruition. And then I think the final element is clearly doing a bit of a portfolio review. And so what we're seeing a lot of folks doing is looking at what are the hardest to abate bits of the portfolio, and does it make sense to selectively divest where you aren't necessarily the best owner, or improve through accelerated decarbonization. We're also seeing folks, in light of some of the trade flow distortions that Fit for 55 will likely create, considering what that means for their supply chain, for their intracompany trading, for all of this, which is also in some cases likely to have portfolio implications. Ceotto, though, I wonder if you might speak to a bit more specifically what this might mean for Brazilian companies and the Brazilian economy more broadly.
Happy to, Anna. A few things that I believe are important to highlight. Right? Anna talked about one of the first points, Brazil has one of the cleanest electric matrix in the world, right? It's about 85% clean. It varies over the year, and depending we're in a drought, so that's a bit lower, but it's very much clean, right? What it creates is other several opportunities that people might not be aware of. The whole trade flows of green hydrogen, which is a way of transporting electricity in long distances, and a very new and emerging market. Brazil is likely to be one of the most competitive countries. You know, we will be able to produce hydrogen between at roughly $1.50 per ton, which puts us into the top 5 most competitive countries to produce hydrogen. The second piece, and then I talked about that, right? Not only in steel production, we can export because we have lower intensity, but also if you compare that intensity relative to the average of the industry, it's about 20% less emissions to produce steel in Brazil than the average globally, right? And it may be even more competitive depending on the regions you're considering. Finally, Brazil has a unique opportunity to lead the market, the offset market, to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway that has been agreed in Paris and is being discussed in COP26 this week. The world will need about 7 gigatons of offsets. One of the cheapest ways of doing that is natural carbon sinking, right? Which is afforestation, recovery of mangroves and things like that. And Brazil is the leading country to do that, right? We represent about 12 to 15% of that market. And if we just do the cut on reforestation and afforestation, that's 1/3 of the world opportunity to do that. And you can issue credits and you can be paid for those credits to offset the emissions. So Brazil has a unique position to be one of the leaders in the new green economy to come. And I believe there's a huge business opportunity for Brazilian companies to explore those markets and become even more international and help lead some of the so much needed solutions to enable this green economy.
Great. Thank you all for the context. I'd like to start the Q&A with Anna. Anna, how is carbon traceability being tackled by regulations?
Great question. And this is much more than $50 million question. But one thing to note is a lot of the detail of EU Fit for 55 will need to be worked out through implementing acts. So we expect to see more clarity in the lead up to the 2023 rollout of the administrative regime. What the EU has signaled, though, is that there will be national authorities that are responsible for validating what importers declare as the embodied carbon of their imports and issuing carbon credits to those importers. How that validation is going to work, effectively a 3-tiered system. In the first instance, someone is able to evidence the embodied carbon of the import. That's signed off, great. That's probably the most precise. In the second instance, where that isn't possible, the EU will plan to default to national averages. And so producers who are more efficient will be penalized under that system, creating an incentive to be able to document their embodied emissions. In the third instance, if robust national data isn't available, then actually what the EU is proposing to do is default to the bottom decile of European producers, which will have some interesting wrinkles that I'm sure we'll see negotiated over the coming years. Because what that would mean in practice is actually that higher emitting countries, and I'm thinking here coal-fired plants in India and in China, actually might be better off than they would be if they were subject to national averages. And so expect to see quite a lot of negotiation around how that works.
Excellent, thank you. And if I may ask another question, can you go through a bit how could intercompany trade flows affect carbon accounting for CBAM, please?
Sure. This is another one where the EU has signaled the intent, but will work out the detail in the implementing acts. But effectively, EU Fit for 55 is intended to tax carbon on imports, and one way or another, it will do that. And so irrespective of whether or not the imported good is destined to market in Europe or is destined to conversion and production in a European supply chain, it will be subject to a carbon tax. And so effectively, you won't see a meaningful differentiation to allow for intercompany trading. What that will mean in practice is also that you will likely see a lot of producers making decisions to reshuffle a bit their own supply chain and location of production. Because if you're transforming and then selling on from Europe, it'll no longer make sense likely to produce in the EU, is likely the distortion that we'll see as a result of that.
Thank you. Bram, can you tell us a bit when we should expect Scope 2 emissions to be included in CBAM, so scope from the energy that used in production systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's being discussed a lot, actually. So for starters, today, the CBAM focuses on Scope 1 emissions, and that's, as you say, relates to the emissions from combusting or using the energy directly in a production process. Now, any electricity that's being used in the production process is considered Scope 2, and therefore is not part of the current specification of CBAM, and that makes a big deal of a difference, particularly for sectors that use a lot of electricity in the production process, for example, aluminum. So the European Union, in its current announcement, has said that it will wait through the transition period that lasts from 2023 to 2025 to set up the administrative scheme. And by the end of that period, so let's say second half of 2025, it will start to revise the scope of the mechanism, which will include also an explicit consideration for whether Scope 2 should be added. Now, the bit of an open question there is, will electricity-heavy sectors, such as aluminum, actually start to already engage in a conversation before that, when they realize that they will be affected negatively by increasing carbon prices, but will not be in a way protected by a CBAM mechanism. And realizing that exposure, we expect that this will be one of the topics for further discussion also going forward.
Bram, what timeline should we expect for other products to be included? For example, agriculture.
Yeah. It's I think another great question where unfortunately there's not a lot of clarity yet. So here too, in its formal announcements, the European Commission has stated that roughly by 2025 there will be the first moment for reconsideration or for expanding the scope. But so for the time being, at least for the next 5-6 years, let's say up until 2026, 2027, it seems like the 5 products that we mentioned earlier will be the products that are particularly affected.
Anna, how carbon offsets and voluntary markets will be accounted for CBAM?
Yeah, great question. And this one has been a topic of huge debate, and I'm sure will continue to be. Current stance is not at all. CBAM is looking for the minute at Scope 1 without inclusion of offsets of any type. And that's intentional by the EU to try to encourage material changes to operations and core processes, and to encourage particularly European producers to invest the capex needed to make their plants cleaner rather than investing in offsets.
And Bram, which new countries should we expect to be included to CBAM? For example, China, the US?
Yeah, I would respond in 2 steps there. So I think the first question is which countries are having emission trading schemes in place or are considering those. And there indeed we see that China has implemented a system. Part of the US has one and is being considered more broadly. And then the second question is, for those countries with the ETS in place, will they also consider CBAM in a way to create a level playing field, at least for the producers within their country. And as we've seen before, there is still several challenges then around trade. But so CBAM is considered a complement for those countries that have an ETS in place. Now, that said, there's many other countries that are considering ETS, and we do expect that the discussion will also gain further momentum, given the wave of net zero announcements that we've seen over the past year or two, where many countries will over the next couple of months and years, need to start specifying how they want to reach their decarbonization targets. So therefore, this is, in a way, a discussion that can be expected to gain further steam in the years to come. And this was explicitly also one of the objectives that the European Commission set by introducing CBAM, hoping to also trigger debates around emission trading schemes in other parts of the world.
And Anna, what fund mechanisms are or will be available?
Great question. So we estimate that reaching the 2030 target that the EU has set will require about 8 trillion euro of investment, which only really becomes break even above a carbon price of about 100 euro per ton of CO2 equivalent. And so what we expect to see is the EU, therefore, and what they have announced they will be doing, subsidizing some elements, particularly around technological innovation, in order to help Europe get there. So there are 3 EU subsidy schemes that I would call out. One is Horizon Europe, which is supporting projects from R&D through to pilot stage. That's about 96 billion euro that's available as funding. Second is the EU Innovation Fund, which supports technologies from pilot through to scale up. That's about 20 billion through to 2030. And then the third clearly is Invest EU and CEF, which is really about rolling out more mature technologies with a particular focus in many instances around the power sector. That'll be about 370 billion in funding through to 2027 or so. And so the EU is putting significant capital behind technological advancement at all stages of maturity, particularly with that kind of 370 billion tranche at the end around rolling out changes to the power sector and supporting CCUS. You also see particular dedicated funding and policy around hydrogen is the other area that I would call out. So yes, there's funding available. Some of the detail of how that gets administered needs to be sorted, but we're starting to see some pilot projects already being offered up. And so you'll see a well-grooved machine there in terms of innovation funding in particular.
Great, wonderful. And what are the main complexities we can expect from CBAM implementation? Great
question. So I'll separate the answer into complexities of administering and implementing the rules and what that will mean for corporates, and complexities in how people think about the economics of their business. So starting with the former, the complexity is going to be, in the first instance, how the national authorities that I was mentioning earlier actually do the carbon accounting and validation, and how that kind of tiered system I described of own evidenced embodied carbon through to national averages through to EU bottom decile works in practice. And also how all of the complexity around buying carbon credits works. So that effectively the EU is giving itself 3 years to figure that out from 2023 through to 2026 before the financial penalties actually come into force. Then, and arguably even more challenging piece will be how companies actually think about the implications for their businesses and what it means for their supply chain and their footprint. So we spoke earlier around intercompany trading and some of the complexity there. We expect to see a lot of changes to procurement policy. We spoke earlier about those who import from the EU. What will this mean for their sourcing strategy? A lot of complexity to work through there. And also a lot of changes likely in where companies choose to locate their production facilities, especially those who are producing in the EU for export. I think we'll need to really think through how the economics work. Some of that is dependent on what Bram described around whether or not other nations actually put into practice similar legislation. Effectively, the EU is taking a bet that its policy and the size of its market will force similar rules elsewhere, but to be seen.
Henrique, I'm thinking about going to the questions from the audience. Do you want to add something, or can I?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, so Bram, that's for you. To which risks companies are exposed to with CBAM implementations?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and in a way it relates to Anna's previous comments. I would say, first of all, CBAM will pose a significant additional administrative burden, and that triggers risks, considerations around compliance, fulfilling the administrative requirements. Then I would say, on the competitiveness implications that we see, there's a risk that there will be distortions because of the national averages that we discussed earlier, where there's actually a gap between the actual emissivity of a production process in a particular country and, let's say, the carbon score that production process is receiving from the CBAM administrative mechanism. Then I would say a third risk that we can think of relates to broader supply chain risks. And you can think there of the very simple notion that with the introduction of a CBAM, as we've seen for companies importing from Europe, that means that the cost of their imports is going up. For companies producing within Europe, their overall production cost goes up, which is then reflected in a higher cost of export. And the question is a little bit, how will supply chains and how will the international trade reshuffle to reflect this new state, and what will be the new equilibrium? And will we see actually in that transition potential trade flow disruptions? And those are questions that we think are relevant to consider. At the same time, is also one of the reasons that the European Union very consciously planned for a transition period where over the course of 3 years, at least part of those challenges can start to be addressed.
Denise, if I may.
Sure.
Anna, let me ask you the flip side, right? What opportunities can come from CBAM? And I remember we talking before, and you mentioned that some countries are being very aggressive in positioning themselves as partners for the EU. I believe you mentioned Morocco. Like, what are countries moving? What are the opportunities, and what are possible implications that Brazilian executives should think about to capture some of those opportunities?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I think to your point earlier, Brazil is in actually quite a good position relative to many other countries to capitalize on some of the potential opportunities. I would bracket them into two categories. One is greater export competitiveness. And we talked about the steel example earlier of Brazil moving to the left on the cost curve. You know, the intuitive or most obvious place that happens is clearly exports to the EU. But I think the other opportunity for executives to have in mind is exports to countries that historically have imported from Europe and who now will face supply chain cost increases and can consider Brazilian goods in lieu of European ones. So this is one huge opportunity. I think the second is also around particularly electricity in the power sector, where Europe has said, and you mentioned Morocco a moment ago, that countries that align their policy with EU ETS and CBAM can also be considered part of a common electrical system with Europe. And so what you'll likely see in response to that is places like North Africa, other proximate regions to Europe, realigning some of their policy in order to be more closely integrated with European energy markets. That, coupled with some of the specific encouragement that Fit for 55 creates for hydrogen, will create a lot of opportunity in power exports and in hydrogen exports to Europe. So that's the other area to be mindful for.
I have a question here for Bram. Do you believe then that in the coming future would it be possible to imagine a whole CBAM worldwide for all economies?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I think first, when we think about the overall global problem that we're trying to solve with all of the mechanisms that we discussed, the decarbonization challenge is a global challenge. And so if we go back again to economists and they're thinking on how can you efficiently address that challenge at a global level, carbon prices are often considered as a very natural instrument. Now, where a CBAM comes in, as the name says, it is the carbon border adjustment, right? So a CBAM is relevant when there are differences in emission trading schemes between one region and the other, either because one region has a scheme and the other one doesn't, or because there's differences in the level of pricing. So we can think about CBAM in a way as a transitional measure, as long as there is a that there's a lack of consistency in pricing schemes globally. In a theoretical world, at some point we could imagine converging to a global trading scheme. Given that clearly that also comes with a lot of implementation challenges, political implications, and so on. I would say it's very realistic to imagine a world where not all of the world is going to have emission trading schemes, and therefore we will likely also see CBAM mechanisms in place as long as that's the case.
Anna, a question for you. How will CBAM work in practice?
Yeah, so the devil is in the details, as with all things. And so how CBAM will likely work in practice, and I caveat this by saying implementing acts will need to be sorted out over the coming 2-3 years, is that you'll see these national authorities stood up country by country that are meant to administer this policy. And so there'll be, as Bram mentioned, a lot of administrative burden to do with that, but you'll see quite a lot of authority vested at the national level. And so one implication for folks that are exporting to the EU is just to really come to understand how those will work country by country and at the European level. The other thing that will happen in practice is a lot of administrative complexity between importing bodies and their trade partners, and quite a lot of detail around carbon accounting and validation. And so the other piece to start to prepare for as this moves towards coming into force is really getting a handle on your Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 emissions, reporting standards, aligning those to the international bodies that are emerging, just to be able to handle that as easily as possible.
Yeah. And Anna, when should companies start thinking about this?
Yeah. So on Scope 1, in our view, yesterday, because in many instances, and for those that are multinationals, with European operations, you'll likely have already seen this. We're seeing a lot of reporting starting to play out in valuations. Right. And so from a capital markets perspective, it makes sense to have a tight handle on accurate carbon reporting now, particularly for Scope 1 and 2. And then as you think about getting a handle on some of the declarations that will need to be made, on some of the trade flow implications, supply chain, et cetera, really, it seems like 2 years through to 2023 is a long time, but given the complexity involved in renegotiating supply chain agreements, it's really no time at all. And so we are seeing many companies already beginning to think through, what does it mean for my supply partners? What does it mean for my customer base? What are some of the longer term contracts that I'm going to need to renegotiate, as the lead time there can be quite considerable? So short answer is now.
Okay, so thank you very much. Henrique, do you want to add something, or can we?
Nope.
gente. Okay, so I'd like to thank you, Ana, Bram, Henrique, for this conversation. Muito obrigada a todos, muito obrigada a você aí de casa também, que ficou os últimos minutos aqui com a gente. Para conhecer a agenda completa do McKinsey Talks, vá a mckinseytalks.com. Lá você tem a agenda para os próximos encontros, tem também os últimos episódios aqui do McKinsey Talks e esse vai estar disponível também nos próximos dias para você. E para quem curte um podcast, também a versão em áudio está disponível no Spotify. Muito obrigada, bom fim de semana, se cuidem e até a próxima. Tchau!